All right. Some technical difficulties this morning for sure. For some reason, I could not get the live stream to go to Rumble. So I had to take it down and set up the whole thing. And I hope you guys find me. Because I'm worried a bunch of you are still sitting on the old thing. Maybe I can take that down. Let's look here. My content. See if we can delete the first one. Yeah, let's delete this one. Confirm. Hopefully that'll kick you guys off that one and then prompt you to find the new one. Crazy thing. All right, let's see how that works. There we go. You guys found me. And why is my camera so weird? We're going to have to adjust it and see. Nope, that made it worse. Let's go this way. Goodness. It's like I've never done this before. We did get a different, there we go. We did get a different mic configuration, which I think is going to be better for us. So good morning, good morning. I definitely am not hearing the bounce back, which was driving me insane. So I'm very happy about that. Welcome. I'm so glad you guys figured out where I was because I wasn't sure myself for a minute. I still feel like I'm way over in the frame. It's funny how it crops right in EV which is the streaming software that I use to get me to Rumble because you can't just stream right on Rumble. That's better. All right, now we're good. Good morning. Good morning. I hope you've had a good week. It's Thursday. Normally we do this on Wednesdays, but we couldn't do it on Wednesday this week because I had a doctor's appointment to learn that I have more kidney stones because, what's not fun about that? I'm going to start selling them as jewelry, I think. Um, just for fun. You guys would buy kidney stone jewelry, right? If it were from me. How gross is that? So we'll see how these go. We're trying to get to the bottom of why I'm making stones. I think it's probably the gastric bypass surgery and the sleeve surgery before it. It's one of the complications you can run into if you've had those surgeries. So if you're considering those surgeries, just keep that in mind. Um, I still wouldn't have not had the surgery, but there we go. Now we're all set. I still wouldn't have not had the surgery, but good morning, Coffin. Um, I I'm trying to think, was the GERD worse or are the kidney stones worse? I think the GERD was worse because it was every day, all the time, and the kidney stones are only intermittently, every month or two. As long as they're small enough that I don't have to have them basketed out, we'll just keep pressing on. But I got to go have some, lunch with my youngest son yesterday. He's getting married May 4th, and just kind of get an update on what's going on with that. I did not realize that GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease, where you get like heartburn, but it comes all the way up into your throat, and it was burning my vocal cords or eroding them. But I did not realize that my oldest son is officiating the wedding, which I just thought was so funny. Not in a bad way, but I'm like, how is your brother officiating the wedding? He's like, oh, he got ordained. And I'm like, ordained in what? He doesn't believe in anything. So apparently my oldest son is ordained in marrying. So if you guys need to be married, uh, I know a guy. Isn't that cute? Do you want to create a Rumble class about your channel? I don't know what that means. A Rumble class about my channel. I don't know what that means. Like teach a class on Rumble about my channel? Do you want to create a Rumble class about your channel? You mean on like how to make a channel? Oh, thank you. Is it Ilya? Ilya Walker? That's pretty. Ilya Walker. Ilya? I don't know how you say that. It'd have to be Ilya. You can't hardly say Ilya. Well, you can if you try hard enough because I just did it. Anyway, we're trying to get things, trying to get some Ilia. It is the long I. Ilia. That's lovely. I really like that. Ilia. I've never heard that. I'll have to suggest that to my daughter if you don't mind. She's expecting a baby. We don't know what the gender is yet, if you're allowed to say that anymore. Um, I always wonder, like, what of gender reveal parties these days? Are you still allowed to do those, or is that faux pas now? I don't know. Or not faux pas. I can't think what the word would be for that. Um, but yes, lovely name and welcome to everybody. I'm so glad you're here. Trying to give everybody a few minutes because I mucked up the stream. There's one thing you can count on me for, and that is technical glitches. But we're trying to get my dad straightened away. I took him up. If you guys would continue praying for dad, his name's John. My brother's name is John too, but just my dad. Sorry, Steve scratched my eye this morning. Steve's got this thing that he does in the morning. He comes and he gets in bed with me. Steve is our cat, just so you don't think I've got another man besides Don. Um, and if I don't pet him right away when he lays next to me, he'll put his paw on my face, and he's not good about keeping his nails all the way in. So this morning, he put his paw on my face and he scratched the surface of my right eye. So if I'm all blinky, that's why. I put some. I've got some eye ointment that's like an antibiotic, so I went ahead and put that in there. But I'll see the eye doctor later today because it's just so much fun. But anyway, we took Dad up to the VA, and his femur is not healing well. He's supposed to be just toe touch weight bearing using a walker, which of course he's not going to do. Um, but I asked Dad, I said, because he's 77 and, his health is not good. And I said, have you ever thought about taking a road trip? Omer Muhammad, I will check that. I checked him yesterday and I didn't see anything. So I'll look today. Um, and I said, have you ever thought about taking a road trip? Where would you like to go? And he said, he'd like to see the Badlands, Wyoming, North Dakota, uh, and Colorado. And I said, let's do that. And he was just like, what? And I said, let's do that. Let's fly out to, he wanted to see Arizona. I said, let's fly out to Arizona, and rent a car and drive from there. And let's do a road trip together. Let's take 2 or 3 weeks and do that. Oh, my eye. Um, and and he's game. And so I just thought that was, my mom's not definitely not going to want to go on a road trip anywhere, but I'll take Dad and go on a road trip. I just thought that'd be a fun father-daughter thing to do. We've never done anything like that before, and I really enjoy spending time with Dad. I enjoy spending time with Mom too. She just doesn't like to go anywhere. So that kind of limits us to her house. But it'd be fun to have this adventure with Dad. So be praying about that. If any of you have ever planned that kind of road trip and have tips for me, drop them in the chat or send me an email. My email is in the description section, um, on YouTube and Rumble. I don't know if you can see it on Facebook or not, but you can always come to YouTube or Rumble. If you are messaging me on Facebook in Messenger, stop it. I don't answer those. I don't look at them. I don't even have the app on my phone. It just got to be where that was all I was doing all day long, and it was sucking me into Facebook where my time was not being well spent. So if you've got something that you need to ask me about or need to have prayer about or whatever, email me. That's the best way to get hold of me. And I answer my emails, as people can attest to, anybody who's emailed. Fat Granny and Angel. Hi, guys. Friendly hellos from Oregon. Angel, have you ever planned a long road trip with your dad or your mom or your husband or anybody? Um, I'm looking for tips. And I'm thinking, I don't want to do hotels. So do we Airbnb the whole thing? And um, I just don't know how to do that. I've never done any. I mean, I've planned short road trips, but nothing like this where we were going to stay with family or something. So that's a lot easier to, you just get to the family's house and that's where you stay. Where we're going to be traveling through, I'm a little apprehensive about it because I've never done anything like that. So if you've done something, send me your story. Our friend Frida, um, who I did girls' night out with, and we will be doing more of those. It's just kind of in limbo right now. Um, she took a road trip, so I'm hoping she sends me her itinerary because it's kind of the same sort of area that Dad's wanting to go. Why are my well, that's weird. My chat's not coming up on Rumble. I give up. I have no idea what I'm doing here. Just run now. All right, guys, I'm going to start. It's 10:44, almost 10:45 here. And Alia says, I've been fascinated with NDE stories ever since my partner was murdered in 2011. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry to hear that. That's terrible. That's terrible. Um, I ran into this guy at the park the other day. So I finally got an e-bike that works for me, and it's a little 20-inch. It's got the wide tire and everything. And Don didn't want me to ride it on the roads until he took me out to the park, where it was safer to kind of test it out. And so I was riding like all over all the terrain. It handles really great on all the terrain. I love this thing. And and it's nice because I just wanted something because I've got a bad knee, and I wanted something because it's so hilly here in Kentucky. You can't if you got a bad knee, you can't really ride. But I knew if I had something that had a throttle on it, that I could use that when I was going up a hill and get out and get a lot more exercise, which I really enjoy. Um, so anyway, I'm riding all around. Well, when I come back, he's standing there talking to this guy. And so I pull up and I'm like, "Hi, my name's Penny." And this guy's name is Eric Penn. And he's written all kinds of books. But he was telling us that his dad and his uncle were, I can't remember the order of the story, but they were incarcerated and MK Ultra'd here in Kentucky. I didn't even realize there was a place here in Kentucky that did that. If you don't know what MK Ultra is, just look it up. Um, and they both became serial killers. I mean, how often do you meet a guy that tells you this story? And I'm thinking, and he didn't strike me as crazy or anything. And he's like, yeah, he said, I've written these books and I'm a counselor now. And, he's got 4 kids and he's traveling across the country. And he wanted to go and see, um, like the graves of the people who were involved in MK Ultra, people who were involved in slavery and abolition. So he's just kind of touring the country looking at this stuff. And um, and so it was interesting because he's a black fella. And so I got talking to him about doing book club and that we're reading of Mice and Men and the N word is in it. And I told him, I said, and this is the disclaimer for anybody who's just watching this book for the first time. Um, I prayed and prayed about whether to say the N word or not, or just say N word. Um, and God really led me to go ahead and say the word because to not say it would almost be to deny the ugliness of it and how it was used um, as a slur in those days, and I mean still today. And so I decided to read it, and I kind of put out a notice, hey guys, if you find this really offensive and you can think of a spiritual reason that I shouldn't be doing it, or if you think my rationale is wrong, send me an email and I'll reconsider. So I was talking to him, and he told me, he said, I want you to look up. Let me find it here. Um, he said that word, the origin of that word, um, hold on, Africa. So, I mean, he had me look it up on the spot. Now I'm not going to be able to find it. Okay, the word nigga, Nigga is how it is spelled, is derived from the word negus, Negus. It is a royal title for Ethiopian and African kings. Did you guys have any idea that that was the origin of that word? Negus, Negus. And he's like, don't feel bad about using it. He said, for the people who know the origin, you are referring to Ethiopian and African kings. And he said, he thought that that was an appropriate word to say, and not the slur, not to slur people, to say it to people, but to use it in the context of the book. And I just was amazed when I read that. I had no idea that that was the origin of the word. So he really enlightened me there. But we're trying to figure out how to do. I mean, would he not be the most amazing interview? Um, we're trying to figure out how to do an interview because he doesn't have a computer, doesn't have a mic. I don't have extras of those things. And as you've seen, like when I tried to do the show with Don, the sound was a super huge issue. So I can't figure out to do it how to do it. I might have to wait till he gets back to California and he can get set up. His daughters can help him get it set up. But anyway, really, really interesting guy. His name is Eric Penn. I looked to see if I could order some of his books, but they're not in print anymore. So it's been a while since he's written them, I guess. Yeah, I never knew that that was the origin either. And I was so blessed to see that there was a good, that the origin of it was good. Um, it was slavery that bastardized the word, so to speak. I sent you oh yeah, if you sent it in Facebook Messenger, I'll never see it. Okay, guys, let's get started here. Let me get our screen share up. So we're starting in chapter 4 today of John Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, and I lost my screen's share, of course, because I had to restart the whole thing. All right, let me make sure you can see that. I don't know if you guys care if you even read along or if you just listen. Jacob Walker, hello. Now, if I don't answer your comments while I'm reading, I'll answer them when we get a break. So don't feel like I'm ignoring you because I would never do that because I'm good people. Okay, Crooks, the Negro stable buck, had his bunk in the harness room, a little shed that leaned off the wall of the barn. On one side of the little room, there was a square four-paned window, and on the other, a narrow plank door leading into the barn. Crook's bunk was a long box filled with straw, on which his blankets were flung. On the wall by the window, there were pegs on which hung broken harness in process of being mended, strips of new leather, and under the window itself a little bench for leather working tools, curved knives, and needles and balls of lined thread, and a small hand riveter. On pegs were also pieces of harness, a split collar with the horsehair stuffing sticking out, a broken hame, and a trace chain with its leather covering split. Crooks had his apple box over his bunk, and in it a range of medicine bottles, both for himself and for the horses. There were cans of saddle soap and a drippy can of tar with its paintbrush sticking over the edge. And scattered about the floor were a number of personal possessions. For being alone, Crooks could leave his things about, and being a stable buck and a cripple, he was more permanent than the other men, and had accumulated more possessions than he could carry on his back. Crooks possessed several pairs of shoes, a pair of rubber boots, a big alarm clock, and a single barreled shotgun. And he had books, too, a tattered dictionary and a mauled copy of the California Civil Code for 1905. There were battered magazines and a few dirty books on a special shelf over his bunk. A pair of large gold-rimmed spectacles hung from a nail on the wall above his bed. This room was swept and fairly neat, for Crooks was a proud, aloof man. He kept his distance and demanded that other people keep theirs. His body was bent over to the left by his crooked spine, and his eyes lay deep in his head, and because of their depth, seemed to glitter with intensity. His lean face was lined with deep black wrinkles, and he had thin, pain-tightened lips which were lighter than his face. It was Saturday night. Through the open door that led into the barn came the sound of moving horses, of feet stirring, of teeth champing on hay, of the rattle of halter chains. In the stable buck's room, a small electric globe threw a meager yellow light. Crooks sat on his bunk. His shirt was out of his jeans and back. In one hand he held a bottle of liniment, and with the other he rubbed his spine. Now and then he poured a few drops of the liniment into his pink-palmed hand and reached up under his shirt to rub again. He flexed his muscles against his back and shivered. Oh, Jacob is Alia's son. Hi, Jacob. Noiselessly, Lenny appeared in the open doorway and stood there looking in, his big shoulders nearly filling the opening. For a moment, Crooks did not see him, but on raising his eyes, He stiffened, and a scowl came on his face. His hand came out from under his shirt. Lenny smiled helplessly in an attempt to make friends. Crooks said sharply, "You got no right come in my room. This here's my room. Nobody got any right in here but me." Lenny gulped, and his smile grew more fawning. "I ain't doing nothing," he said. "Just come to look at my puppy, and I seen your light," he explained. "Well, I got a right to have a light. You go on, get out of my room. I ain't wanted in the bunkhouse, and you ain't wanted in my room." "Why ain't you wanted?" Lenny asked. "'Cause I'm black. They play cards in there, but I can't play 'cause I'm black. They say I stink. Well, I tell you, you all stink to me." Lenny flapped his big hands helplessly. "Everybody went into town," he said. "Slim and George and everybody. George says I gotta stay here and not get in trouble. I seen your light." "Well, what do you want?" "Nothing. I seen your light. I thought I could just come in and set." Crooks stared at Lenny, and he reached behind him and took down the spectacles and adjusted them over his pink ears and stared again. "I don't know what you're doing in the barn anyway," he complained. "You ain't no Skinner. There's no call for a bucker to come into the barn at all. You ain't no Skinner. You ain't got nothing to do with the horses." "The pup," Lenny repeated. "I come to see my pup." "Well, go see your pup then. Don't come in a place where you're not wanted." Lenny lost his smile. He advanced a step into the room, then remembered, and backed to the door again. "I looked at 'em a little. Slim says I ain't to pet 'em very much." Crooks said, "Well, you be taking 'em out of the nest all the time. I wonder the old lady don't move 'em someplace else." "Oh, she don't care. She lets me." Lenny had moved into the room again. Crooks scowled, but Lenny's disarming smile defeated him. "Come in and set a while," Crooks said. "Long as you won't get out and leave me alone, you might as well set down." His tone was a little more friendly. "All the boys gone to town, huh?" "All but old Candy. He just sets in the bunkhouse, sharpening his pencil and sharpening and figuring." Crooks adjusted his glasses. "Figuring? What's Candy figuring about?" Lenny almost shouted. "'Bout the rabbits." "You're nuts," said Crooks. "You're crazy as a wedge. What rabbits you talking about?" "The rabbits we're gonna get, and I get to tend 'em, cut grass and give 'em water and like that." "Just nuts," said Crooks. "I don't blame the guy you travel with for keeping you out of sight." Lenny said quietly, "It ain't no lie. We're gonna do it. Gonna get a little place and live on the fat of the land." Crooks settled himself more comfortably on his bunk. "Set down," he invited. "Set down on the nail keg." Lenny hunched down on the little barrel. "You think it's a lie," Lenny said, "but it ain't no lie. Every word's the truth, and you can ask George." Crooks put his dark chin into his pink palm. "You travel around with George, don't you?" "Sure. Me and him goes every place together." Crooks continued. "Sometimes he talks and you don't know what the hell he's talking about. Ain't that so?" He leaned forward, boring Lenny with his deep eyes. "Ain't that so?" "Yeah, sometimes." "Just talking on and you don't know what the hell it's all about." "Yeah, sometimes, but not always." Crooks leaned forward over the edge of the bunk. "I ain't a Southern Negro," he said. "I was born right here in California. My old man had a chicken ranch, 'bout 10 acres. The white kids come to play at our place, and sometimes I went to play with them, and some of them was purty nice. My old man didn't like that. I never knew till long later why he didn't like that, but I know now." He hesitated, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. There wasn't another colored family for miles around, and now there ain't a colored man on this ranch, and there's just one family in Soledad," he laughed. "If I say something, why, it's just a nigger saying it." Lenny asked, "How long you think it'll be before them pups'll be old enough to pet?" Crooks laughed again. A guy can talk to you and be sure you won't go babbling. Couple of weeks and them pups'll be all right. George knows understand nothing. He leaned forward excitedly. This is just a nigger talking, and a busted back nigger, so it don't mean nothing, see? You couldn't remember it anyway. I seen it over and over, a guy talking to another guy, and it don't make no difference if he don't hear or understand. The thing is, they're talking or they're settin' still not talking. It don't make no difference. No difference. His excitement had increased until he pounded his knee with his hand. George can tell you screwy things, and it don't matter. It's just the talking. It's just being with another guy. That's all. He paused. His voice grew soft and persuasive. Suppose George don't come back no more. Suppose he took a powder and just ain't coming back. What'll you do then? Lenny's attention came gradually to what had been said. What? He demanded. I said, suppose George went into town tonight and you never heard of him no more. Crooks pressed forward some kind of private victory. Just suppose that, he repeated. He won't do that, Lenny cried. George wouldn't do nothing like that. I've been with George a long time. He'll come back tonight. But the doubt was too much for him. Don't you think he will? Crook's face lighted with pleasure in his torture. Nobody can't tell a guy what a Nobody can't tell what a guy'll do, he observed calmly. Let's say he wants to come back and can't. Suppose he gets killed or hurt so he can't come back. Lenny struggled to understand. George won't do nothing like that, he repeated. George is careful. He won't get hurt. He ain't never been hurt 'cause he's careful. Well, just suppose he don't come back. What'll you do then? Lenny's face wrinkled with apprehension. I don't know. Say what you doing anyways, he cried. This ain't true. George ain't got hurt. Crooks bored in on him. Want me to tell you what'll happen? They'll take you to the booby hatch. They'll tie you up with the collar like a dog. Suddenly, Lenny's eyes centered and grew quiet and mad. He stood up and walked dangerously toward Crooks. Who hurt George? He demanded. Crooks saw the danger as it approached him. He edged back on his bunk to get out of the way. I was just supposing, he said. George ain't hurt. He's all right. He'll be back all right. Lenny stood over him. What you supposing for? Ain't nobody going to suppose no hurt to George. Crooks removed his glasses and wiped his eyes with his fingers. Just set down, he said. George ain't hurt. Lenny growled back to his seat on the nail keg. Ain't nobody gonna talk no hurt to George, he grumbled. Crooks said gently, maybe you can see now. You got George. You know he's gonna come back. Suppose you didn't have nobody. Suppose you couldn't go into the bunkhouse and play rummy 'cause you was black. How'd you like that? Suppose you had to sit out here and read books. Sure you could get sure you could play horseshoes till it got dark, but then you got to read books. Books ain't no good. A guy needs somebody to be near him, he whined. A guy goes nuts if he ain't got nobody. Don't make no difference who the guy is long he's with you. I tell you, he cried. I tell you, a guy gets too lonely and he gets sick. George gonna come back, Lenny reassured himself in a frightened voice. Maybe George come back already. Maybe I better go see. Crooks said, I didn't mean to scare you. He'll come back. I was talking about myself. A guy sits alone out here at night, maybe reading books or thinking or stuff like that. Sometimes he gets thinking and he got nothing to tell him what's so and what ain't so. Maybe if he sees something, he don't know whether it's right or not. He can't turn to some other guy and ask him if he sees it too. He can't tell. He's got nothing to measure by. I seen things out here. I wasn't drunk. I don't know if I was asleep. If some guy was with me, he could tell me I was asleep, and then it would be all right. But I just don't know. Crooks was looking across the room now, looking toward the window. Lenny said miserably, George wouldn't go away and leave me. I know George wouldn't do that to me. The stable buck went on dreamily. I remember when I was a little kid on my old man's chicken ranch. Had two brothers. They's always near me, always there. Used to sleep right in the same room, right in the same bed, all three. Had a strawberry patch. Had an alfalfa patch. Used to turn the chickens out in the alfalfa on a sunny morning. My brother set out on a fence rail and watch 'em. White chickens they was. Gradually, Lenny's interest came around to what was being said. George says we're going to have alfalfa for the rabbits. What rabbits? We're going to have rabbits in the berry patch? You're nuts. We are too. Just ask George. You're nuts. Crooks was scornful. I seen hundreds of men come by the one road on the ranches with their bindles on their back and the same damn thing in their heads. Hundreds of 'em. They come on, they quit and go on, and every damn one of 'em's got a little piece of land in his head, and never a damn one of 'em ever gets it, just like heaven. Everybody wants a little piece of land. I read plenty of books out here. Nobody never gets to heaven, and nobody gets no land. It's just in their head. They're all time talking about it, but it's just in their head. He paused and looked toward the open door, for the horses were moving restlessly, and the halter chains clinked. A horse whinnied. I guess somebody's out there, Crooks said. Maybe Slim. Slim comes in sometimes too, 3 times a night. Slim's a real skinner. He looks out for his team. He pulled himself painfully upright and moved toward the door. That you, Slim? He called. Candy's voice answered. Slim went into town. Say, you seen Lenny? You mean the big guy? Yeah, seen him around any place? He's in here, Crooks said shortly. He went back to his bunk and lay down. Candy stood in the doorway, scratching his bald wrist and looking blindly into the lighted room. He made no attempt to enter. Tell you what, Lenny, I've been figuring out about them rabbits. Crooks said irritably, You can come in if you want. Candy seemed embarrassed. I do know, course, if you want me to. Oh, I don't know, course, if you want me to. Come on in. If everybody's coming in, you might just as well. It was difficult for Crooks to conceal his pleasure with anger. Candy came in, but he was still embarrassed. You got a nice cozy little place in here, he said to Crooks. Must be nice to have a room all to yourself this way. Sure, said Crooks, and a manure pile under the window. Sure, it's swell. Lenny broke in. You said 'bout them rabbits? Candy leaned against the wall beside the broke collar while he scratched the wrist stump. I've been here a long time, he said, and Crook's been here a long time. This is the first time I ever been in his room. Crook said darkly, Guys don't come into a colored man's room very much. Nobody been here but Slim and the boss. Candy quickly changed the subject. Slim's as good a skinner as I ever seen. Lenny leaned toward the old swamper. "'Bout them rabbits," he insisted. Candy smiled. "I got it figured out. We can make some money on them rabbits if we go about it right." "But I get to tend 'em," Lenny broke in. "George says I get to tend 'em. He promised." Crooks interrupted brutally. "You guys is just kidding yourself. You talk about it a hell of a lot, but you won't get no land. You'll be a swamper here till they take you out in a box. Hell, I seen too many guys. Lenny here'll quit and be on the road in 2, 3 weeks. Seems like every guy got land in his head." Candy rubbed his cheek angrily. "You damn right we gonna do it. George says we are. We got the money right now." "Yeah," said Crooks. "And where's George now? In town in a whorehouse. That's where your money's going. I seen it happen too many times. I seen too many guys with land in their head. They never get none under their hand." Candy cried. "Sure, they all want it. Everybody wants a little bit of land, not much, just something that was his, something he could live on, and there couldn't nobody throw him off it. I never had none. I planted crops for damn near everybody in this state, but they wasn't my crops, and when I harvest 'em, it wasn't none of my harvest. But we're going to do it now, and don't make no mistake about that. George ain't got the money in town. That money's in the bank. Me and Lenny and George. We're going to have rooms to ourselves. We're going to have a dog and rabbits and chickens. We're going to have green corn and maybe a cow or a goat." He stopped, overwhelmed with his picture. Crook said, "You say you got the money." "Damn right, we got most of it, just a little bit more to get. Have it all in 1 month. George got the land all picked out, too." Crooks reached around and explored his spine with his hand. "I never seen a guy really do it," he said. "I seen guys nearly crazy with loneliness for land, but every time a whorehouse or a blackjack game took what it takes." He hesitated. "If you guys would want a hand to work for nothing, just as keep, why, I'd come and lend a hand. I ain't so crippled I can't work like a son of a bitch if I want to." "Any of you boys seen Curly?" They swung their heads toward the door, looking. It was Curly's wife. Her face was heavily made up. Her lips were slightly parted. She breathed strongly as though she'd been running. "Curly ain't been here," Candy said sourly. She still stood in the doorway, smiling a little at them, rubbing the nails of one hand with the thumb and forefinger of the other, and her eyes traveled from one face to another. "They left all the weak ones here," she said finally. "Think I don't know where they all went, even Curly? I know where they all went." Lenny watched her, fascinated, but Candy and Crooks were scowling down away from her eyes. Candy said, "Then if you know, why you want to ask us where Curly's at?" She regarded them amusedly. "Funny thing," she said. "If I catch any one man and he's alone, I get along fine with him. But just let two of the guys get together and you won't talk. Just nothing but mad." She dropped her fingers and put her hands on her hips. "You're all scared of each other, that's what. Every one of you's scared the rest is going to get something on you." After a pause, Crook said, "Maybe you better go along to your own house now. We don't want no trouble." "Well, I ain't giving you no trouble. Think I don't like to talk to somebody else once in a while? Think I like to stick in that house all the time?" Candy laid the stump of his wrist on his knee and rubbed it gently with his hand. He said accusingly, "You got a husband. You got no call fooling around with other guys, causing trouble." The girl flared up. "Sure I got a husband. You all seen him. Swell guy, ain't he? Spends all his time saying what he's going to do to guys he don't like. And he don't like nobody. Think I'm going to stay in that 2x4 house and listen how Curly's going to lead with his left twick, then bring in the old right cross? 1, 2, he says, just the old 1, 2, and he'll go down." She paused and her face lost its sullenness and grew interested. "Say, what happened to Curly's hand?" There was an embarrassed silence. Candy stole a look at Lenny. Then he coughed. "Why, Curly, he got his hand caught in a machine, ma'am. Bust his hand." She watched for a moment and then she laughed. "Baloney! What do you think you're selling me? Curly started somepin' he didn't finish. Caught in a machine. Baloney! Why, he ain't give nobody the good old one, too, since he got his hand bust. Who bust him?" Candy repeated sullenly. "Got it caught in a machine." "All right," she said contemptuously. "All right, cover 'em up if you want. What do I care? You bindlebums think you're so damn good. What do you think I am, a kid? I tell you, I could have went with shows. Not just one neither, and a guy told me he could put me in pictures." She was breathless with indignation. "Saturday night, everybody out doing something. Everybody. And what am I doing? Standing here talking to a bunch of bindle stiffs. A nigger and a dum-dum and a lousy old sheep. And liking it because they ain't nobody else." Lenny watched her, his mouth half open. Crooks had retired into the terrible protective dignity of the Negro. But a change came over old Candy. He stood up suddenly and knocked his nail keg over backward. "I had enough," he said angrily. "You ain't wanted here. We told you you ain't. And I tell you, you got floozy ideas about what us guys amounts to. You ain't got sense enough in that chicken head to even see that we ain't stiffs. Suppose you get us canned. Suppose you do. You think we'll hit the highway and look for another lousy 2-bit job like this?" You don't know that we got our own ranch to go to and our own house. We ain't got to stay here. We got a house and chickens and fruit trees and a place 100 times prettier than this. And we got friends. That's what we got. Maybe there was a time when we was scared of getting canned, but we ain't no more. We got our own land and it's ours and we can go to it. Curly's wife laughed at him. Baloney, she said. I seen too many you guys. If you had 2 bits in the world, why you'd be in getting 2 shots of corn with it and sucking the bottom of the glass. I know you guys. Candy's face had grown redder and redder, but before she was done speaking, he had control of himself. He was the master of the situation. I might have knew, he said gently. Maybe you just better go along and roll your hoop. We ain't got nothing to say to you at all. We know what we got, and we don't care whether you know it or not. So maybe you better just scatter along now, 'cause Curly maybe ain't gonna like his wife out in the barn with us bindle stiffs. She looked from one face to another, and they were all closed against her. And she looked longest at Lenny, until he dropped his eyes in embarrassment. Suddenly she said, "Where'd you get them bruises on your face?" Lenny looked up guiltily. "Who, me?" "Yeah, you." Lenny looked to Candy for help, and then he looked at his lap again. "He got his hand caught in the machine," he said. Curly's wife laughed. "Okay, machine. I'll talk to you later. I like machines." Candy broke in. "You let this guy alone. Don't you do no messing around with him. I'm going to tell George what you says. George won't have you messing with Lenny." "Who's George?" she asked. "The little guy you come with?" Lenny smiled happily. "That's him," he said. "That's the guy, and he's going to let me tend the rabbits." "Well, if that's what you all want, I might get a couple rabbits myself." Crook stood up from his bunk and faced her. "I had enough," he said coldly. "You got no rights coming in a colored man's room. You got no rights messing around in here at all. Now you just get out and get out quick. If you don't, I'm going to ask the boss not to ever let you come in the barn no more." She turned on him in scorn. "Listen, nigger," she said. "You know what I can do to you if you open your trap?" Crook stared hopelessly at her, and then he sat down on his bunk and drew into himself. She closed on him. "You know what I could do?" Crook seemed to grow smaller, and he pressed himself against the wall. "Yes, ma'am." "Will you keep your place then, nigger? I could get you strung up on a tree so easy it ain't even funny." Crooks had reduced himself to nothing. There was no personality, no ego, nothing to arouse either like or dislike. He said, "Yes, ma'am," and his voice was toneless. For a moment she stood over him as though waiting for him to move so that she could whip at him again. But Crook sat perfectly still, his eyes averted, everything that might be hurt drawn in. She turned at last to the other two. Old Candy was watching her, fascinated. "If you was to do that, we'd tell," he said quietly. "We'd tell about you framing crooks." "Tell 'em be damned," she cried. "Nobody'd listen to you." Candy subsided. "No," he agreed. "Nobody'd listen to us." Lenny whined. "I wish George was here. I wish George was here." Candy stepped over to him. "Don't you worry none," he said. "I just heard the guys coming in. George'll be in the bunkhouse right now, I bet." He turned to Curly's wife. "You better get home now," he said quietly. "If you go get right now, we won't tell Curly you was here." She appraised him coolly. "I ain't sure you heard nothing." "Better not take no chances," he said. "If you ain't sure, you better take the safe way." She turned to Lenny. "I'm glad you bust up Curly a little bit. He got it coming to him. Sometimes I'd like to bust him myself." She slipped out the door and disappeared into the dark barn. And while she went through the barn, the halter chains rattled, and some horses snorted, and some stamped their feet. Crooks seemed to come slowly out of the layers of protection he had put on. "Was that the truth, what you said about the guys coming back?" he said. "Sure, I heard 'em." Well, I didn't hear nothing. The gate banged, Candy said, and he went on. Jesus, Curly's wife can move quiet. I guess she had a lot of practice, though. Crooks avoided the whole subject now. Maybe you guys better go, he said. I ain't sure I want you in here no more. A colored man got to have some rights, even if you don't like 'em. Candy said, That bitch didn't ought to have said that to you. It wasn't nothing, Crooks said dully. You guys come in and settin' made me forget. What she says is true. The horses snorted out in the barn and the chains rang, and a voice called out, Lenny! Oh, Lenny, you in the barn? It's George, Lenny cried, and he answered, Here, George, I'm right in here. In a second, George stood framed in the door, and he looked disapprovingly about. What you doing in Crook's room? You hadn't ought to be in here. Crooks nodded. I told 'em, but they come in anyways. Well, why didn't you kick 'em out? I didn't care much, said Crooks. Lenny's a nice fella. Now Candy aroused himself. Oh, George, I've been figuring and figuring. I got it doped out how we can even make some money on them rabbits. George scowled. I thought I told you not to tell nobody about that. Candy was crestfallen. Didn't tell nobody but Crooks. George said, Well, you guys get out of here. Jesus, seems like I can't go away for a minute. Candy and Lenny stood up and went toward the door. Crooks called, Candy. Huh? 'Member what I said about hoeing and doing odd jobs? Yeah, said Candy. I remember. Well, just forget it, said Crooks. I didn't mean it. Just fooling. I wouldn't want to go no place like that. Well, okay, if you feel like that. Good night. The three men went out the door. As they went through the barn, the horses snorted and the halter chains rattled. Crooks sat on his bunk and looked at the door for a moment, and then he reached for the liniment bottle. He pulled out his shirt and back, poured a little liniment in his pink palm, and reaching around, he fell slowly to rubbing his back. Chapter 5. One end of the great barn was piled high with new hay, and over the pile hung the 4-taloned Jackson fork suspended from its pulley. The hay came down like a mountain slope to the other end of the barn, and there was a level place as yet unfilled with the new crop. At the sides the feeding racks were visible, and between the slats the heads of horses could be seen. It was Sunday afternoon. The resting horses nibbled the remaining wisps of hay, and they stamped their feet, and they bit the wood of the mangers and rattled the halter chains. The afternoon sun sliced in through the cracks of the barn walls and lay in bright lines on the hay. There was the buzz of flies in the air, the lazy afternoon humming. From outside came the clang of horseshoes on the playing peg and the shouts of men playing, encouraging, jeering. But in the barn it was quiet and humming and lazy and warm. Thank you, Jacob. Only Lenny was in the barn, and Lenny sat in the hay beside a packing case under a manger in the end of the barn that had not been filled with hay. Lenny sat in the hay and looked at a little dead puppy that lay in front of him. Oh no, Lenny. Lenny looked at it for a long time, and then he put out his huge hand and stroked it clear from one end to the other. And Lenny said softly to the puppy, Why'd you go to get killed? You ain't so little as mice. I didn't bounce you hard. He bent the puppy's head up and looked in its face, and he said to it, Now maybe George ain't gonna let me tend no rabbits if he finds out you got killed. He scooped a little hollow and laid the puppy in it and covered it over with hay, out of sight. But he continued to stare at the mound he had made. He said, This ain't no bad thing like I gotta go hiding in the brush. Oh no, this ain't. I'll tell George I found it dead. He buried the puppy and inspected it, and he stroked it, unburied the puppy and inspected it, and he stroked it from ears to tail. He went on sorrowfully, But he'll know. George always knows. He'll say, You done it. Don't try to put nothing over on me. And he'll say, now just for that, you don't get to tend no rabbits. Suddenly his anger rose. Damn you, he cried. Why'd you gotta get killed? You ain't so little as mice. He picked up the pup and hurled it from him. He turned his back on it. He sat bent over his knees and he whispered, now I won't get to tend the rabbits. Now he won't let me. He rocked himself back and forth in sorrow. From outside came the clang of horseshoes on the iron stake, and then a little chorus of cries. Lenny got up and brought the puppy back and laid it on the hay and sat down. He stroked the pup again. You wasn't big enough, he said. They told me and told me you wasn't. I didn't know you'd get killed so easy. He worked his fingers on the pup's limp ear. Maybe George won't care, he said. This here damn little son bitch wasn't nothing to George. Curly's wife came around the end of the last stall. She came very quietly so that Lenny didn't see her. She wore her bright cotton dress and the mules with the red ostrich feathers. Her face was made up and the little sausage curls were all in place. She was quite near to him before Lenny looked up and saw her. In a panic, he shoveled hay over the puppy with his fingers. He looked sullenly up at her. She said, What you got there, sonny boy? Lenny glared at her. George says I ain't to have nothing to do with you, talk to you or nothing. She laughed. George giving you orders about everything? Lenny looked down at the hay. Says I can't tend no rabbits if I talk to you or anything. She said quietly, He's scared Curly'll get mad. Well, Curly got his arm in a sling, and if Curly gets tough, you can break his other hand. You didn't put nothing over on me about getting caught in no machine. But Lenny was not to be drawn. No, sir, I ain't gonna talk to you or nothing. She knelt in the hay beside him. Listen, she said, all the guys got a horseshoe tenement going on, and it's only about 4 o'clock. None of them guys is gonna leave that tenement. Why can't I talk to you? I never get to talk to nobody. I get awful lonely. Lenny said, Well, I ain't supposed to talk to you or nothing. I get lonely, she said. You can talk to people, but I can't talk to nobody but Curly, else he gets mad. How'd you like not to talk to anybody? Lenny said, Well, I ain't supposed to. George scared I'll get in trouble. She changed the subject. What you got covered up there? Then all of Lenny's woe came back on him. Just my pup, he said sadly. Just my little pup, and he swept the hay from on top of it. Why, he's dead, she cried. He was so little, said Lenny. I was just playing with him, and he made like he's going to bite me, and I made like I was going to smack him, and I done it, and then he was dead. She consoled him. Don't you worry none. He's just a mutt. You can get another one easy. The whole country's full of mutts. It ain't that so much, Lenny explained miserably. George ain't gonna let me tend no rabbits now. Why don't he? Well, he said if I done any more bad things, he ain't gonna let me tend no rabbits. She moved closer to him and she spoke soothingly. Don't you worry about talking to me. Listen to the guys yell out there. They got $4 bet in that tournament. None of them ain't gonna leave till it's over. If George sees me talking to you, he'll give me hell, Lenny said cautiously. He told me so. Her face grew angry. What's the matter with me? She cried. Ain't I got a right to talk to nobody? What do they think I am anyways? You're a nice guy. I don't know why I can't talk to you. I ain't doing no harm to you. Well, George says you'll get us in a mess. Aw, nuts, she said. What kind of harm am I doing to you? Seems like they ain't none of them cares how I gotta live. I tell you, I ain't used to living like this. I could have made something of myself, she said darkly. Maybe I will yet. And then her words tumbled out in a passion of communication, as though she hurried before her listener could be taken away. I lived right in Salinas, she said. Come there when I was a kid. Well, a show come through, and I met one of those actors, and he says I could go with the show, but my old lady wouldn't let me. She says because I was only 15. But the guy said I could. If I'd went, I'd be living like this. You bet. I wouldn't be living like this. You bet. Lenny stroked the pup back and forth. We gonna have a little place and rabbits, he explained. She went on with her story quickly before she could be interrupted. Another time I met a guy and he was in pictures. Went out to Riverside Dance Palace with him. He says he's going to put me in the movies. Says I was a natural. Soon he got back to Hollywood. He's going to write to me about it. She looked closely at Lenny to see whether she was impressing him. I never got that letter, she said. I always thought my old lady stole it. Well, I wasn't going to stay no place where I couldn't get nowhere or make something of myself and where they stole your letters. I asked her if she stole it too, and she says no. So I married Curly. Met him out to the Riverside Dance Palace that same night. She demanded. You listening? Me? Sure. Well, I ain't told this to nobody before. Maybe I oughtn't to. I don't like Curly. He ain't a nice fella. And because she had confided in him, she moved closer to Lenny and sat beside him. Could have been in the movies and had nice clothes, all them nice clothes like they wear, and I could have sat in them big hotels and had pictures took of me. When they had them previews, I could have went to them and spoke in the radio, and it wouldn't have cost me a cent because I was in the picture. And all them nice clothes like they wear, because this guy says I was a natural. She looked up at Lenny, and she made a small grand gesture with her arm and hand to show that she could act. The fingers trailed after her leading wrist, and her little fingers stuck out grandly from the rest. Lenny sighed deeply. From the outside came the clang of a horseshoe on metal, and then a chorus of cheers. Somebody made a ringer, said Curly's wife. Now the light was lifting as the sun went down, and the sun streaks climbed up the wall and fell over the feeding racks and over the heads of the horses. Lenny said, Maybe if I took this pup out and throwed him away, George would never know, and then I could tend the rabbits without no trouble. Curly's wife said angrily, Don't you think of nothing but rabbits? We gonna have a little place, Lenny explained patiently. We gonna have a house and a garden and a place for alfalfa, and that alfalfa's for the rabbits. And I take a sack and I get it all full of alfalfa, and then I take it to the rabbits. She asked, What makes you so nuts about rabbits? Lenny had to think carefully before he could come to a conclusion. He moved cautiously close to her until he was right against her. I like to pet nice things. Once at a fair, I seen some of them long-haired rabbits, and they was nice, you bet. Sometimes I even pet mice, but not when I could get nothing better. Curly's wife moved away from him a little. I think you're nuts, she said. No, I ain't, Lenny explained earnestly. George says I ain't. I like a pet nice things with my fingers, soft things. She was a little bit reassured. Well, who don't? She said. Everybody likes that. I like to feel silk and velvet. Do you like to feel velvet? Lenny chuckled with pleasure. You bet by God, he cried happily. And I had some too. A lady give me some, and that lady was my own Aunt Clara. She give it right to me about this big a piece. I wished I had that velvet now. A frown came over his face. I lost it, he said. I ain't seen it for a long time. Curly's wife laughed at him. You're nuts, she said. But you're kind of a nice fella, just like a big baby. But a person can see kind of what you mean. When I'm doing my hair sometimes, I just sit and stroke it 'cause it's so soft. To show how she did it, she ran her fingers over the top of her head. Some people got kind of coarse hair, she said complacently. Take Curly, his hair just like wire, but mine is soft and fine. Course I brush it a lot. That makes it fine. Here, feel right here. She took Lenny's hand and put it on her head. Feel right round here and see how soft it is. Lenny's big fingers fell to stroking her hair. Don't you muss it up, she said. Lenny said, Oh, that's nice. And he stroked harder. Oh, that's nice. Look out now, you'll muss it. And then she cried angrily, You stop it now, you'll mess it all up. She jerked her head sideways and Lenny's fingers closed on her hair and hung on. Let go, she cried. You let go. Lenny was in a panic. His face was contorted. She screamed then, and Lenny's other hand closed over her mouth and nose. Please don't, he begged. Oh, please don't do that. George'll be mad. She struggled violently under his hands. Her feet battered on the hay, and she writhed to be free. And from under Lenny's hand came a muffled screaming. Lenny began to cry with fright. Oh, please don't do none of that, he begged. George's going to say I done a bad thing. He ain't going to let me tend no rabbits. He moved his hand a little, and her hoarse cry came out. Then Lenny grew angry. Now don't, he said. I don't want you to yell. You're going to get me in trouble, just like George says you will. Now you don't do that. And she continued to struggle, and her eyes were wild with terror. He shook her then, and he was angry with her. Don't you go yelling, he said, and he shook her, and her body flopped like a fish. And then she was still, for Lenny had broken her neck. He looked down at her, and carefully he removed his hand from over her mouth, and she lay still. I don't want to hurt you, he said, but George'll be mad if you yell. When she didn't answer nor move, he bent closely over her. He lifted her arm and let it drop. For a moment he seemed bewildered, and then he whispered in fright, I done a bad thing. I done another bad thing. He pawed up the hay until it partly covered her. From outside the barn came a cry of men and a double clang of shoes on metal. For the first time, Lenny became conscious of the trouble. He crouched down in the hay and listened. I've done a real bad thing, he said. I shouldn't have did that. George'll be mad. And he said, and hide in the brush till he come. He's gonna be mad. In the brush till he come. That's what he said. Lenny went back and looked at the dead girl. The puppy lay close to her. Lenny picked it up. I'll throw 'em away, he said. It's bad enough like it is. He put the pup under his coat and he crept to the barn wall and peered out between the cracks toward the horseshoe game. And then he crept around the end of the last manger and disappeared. The sun streaks were high on the wall by now, and the light was growing soft in the barn. Curly's wife lay on her back, and she was half covered with hay. It was very quiet in the barn, and the quiet of the afternoon was on the ranch. Even the clang of the pitched shoes, even the voices of the men in the game seemed to grow more quiet. The air in the barn was dusky in advance of the outside day. A pigeon flew in through the open hay door and circled and flew out again. Around the last stall came a shepherd bitch, lean and long, with heavy hanging dugs. Halfway to the packing box where the puppies were, she caught the dead scent of Curly's wife, and the hair rose along her spine. She whimpered and cringed to the packing box and jumped in among the puppies. Curly's wife lay with a half covering of yellow hay, and the meanness and the plannings and the discontent and the ache for attention were all gone from her face. She was very pretty and simple, and her face was sweet and young. Now her rouged cheeks and her reddened lips made her seem alive and sleeping very lightly. The curls, tiny little sausages, were spread out on the hay behind her head, and her lips were parted. As happy sometimes, a moment settled and hovered and remained for much more than a moment, as happens sometimes, and sound stopped and movement stopped for much, much more than a moment. Then, gradually, time awakened again and moved sluggishly on. The horses stamped on the other side of the feeding racks, and the halter chains clinked. Outside, the men's voices became louder and clearer. From around the end of the last stall, old Candy's voice came. "Lenny," he called. "Oh, Lenny, you in here? I've been figuring some more. Tell you what we can do, Lenny." Old Candy appeared around the end of the last stall. "Oh, Lenny," he called again, and then he stopped, and his body stiffened. He rubbed his smooth wrist on his white stubbled whiskers. I didn't know you's here," he said to Curly's wife. When she didn't answer, he stepped near. "You oughtn't to sleep out here," he said disapprovingly, and then he was beside her. And oh, Jesus! He looked about helplessly and he rubbed his beard, and then he jumped up and went quickly out of the barn. But the barn was alive now. The horses stamped and snorted, and they chewed the straw of their bedding, and they clashed the chains of their halters. In a moment, Candy came back, and George was with him. George said, "What was it you wanted me to see about?" Candy pointed at Curly's wife. George stared. "What's the matter with her?" he asked. He stepped closer, and then he echoed Candy's words. "Oh, Jesus." He was down on his knees beside her. He put his hand over her heart, and finally when he stood up, slowly and stiffly, his face was as hard and tight as wood, and his eyes were hard. Candy said, "What done it?" George looked coldly at him. "Ain't you got any idea?" he asked, and Candy was silent. "I shoulda knew," George said hopelessly. "I guess maybe way back in my head I did." Candy asked, "What we gonna do now, George? What we gonna do now?" George was a long time in answering. "Guess we gotta tell the guys. I guess we gotta get him and lock him up. We can't let him get away. Why, the poor bastard'd starve." And he tried to reassure himself. "Maybe they'll lock him up and be nice to him." But Candy said excitedly, "We ought to let him get away. You don't know that. Curly got to want to get him lynched. Goodness. Curly'll get him killed." George watched Candy's lips. "Yeah," he said at last. "That's right. Curly will. And the other guys will." And he looked back at Curly's wife. Now Candy spoke his greatest fear. "You and me can get that little place, can't we, George? You and me can go there and live nice, can't we, George? Can't we?" Before George answered, Candy dropped his head and looked down at the hay. He knew. George said softly, "I think I knowed from the very first. I think I knowed we'd never do her. He used to like to hear about it so much. I got to thinking maybe we would." "Then it's all off," Candy said sulkily. George didn't answer his question. George said, "I'll work my month and take my $50 and I'll stay all night in some lousy cat house or I'll sit in some pool room till everybody goes home. And then I'll come back and work another month and I'll have $50 more." Candy said, "He's such a nice fella. I didn't think he'd do nothing like this." George still stared at Curly's wife. "Lenny's never done it in meanness," he said. "All the times he's done bad things, but he never done one of 'em mean." He straightened up and looked back at Candy. "Now listen, we got to tell the guys. They got to bring him in, I guess. There ain't no way out. Maybe they won't hurt him," he said sharply. "I ain't going to let 'em hurt Lenny. Now you listen. The guys might think I was in on it. I gonna go in the bunkhouse. Then in a minute you come out and tell the guys about her, and I'll come along and make like I never seen her. Will you do that? So the guys won't think I was in on it?" Candy said, "Sure, George. Sure. I'll do that." "Okay, give me a couple minutes then, and you come running and tell like you just found her. I'm going now." George turned and went quickly out of the barn. Old Candy watched him go. He looked helplessly back at Curly's wife, and gradually his sorrow and his anger grew into words. "You damn tramp," he said viciously. "You done it, didn't you? I suppose you're glad. Everybody know you'd mess things up. You wasn't no good. You ain't no good now, you lousy tart," he sniveled, and his voice shook. "I could have hoed in the garden and washed dishes for them guys." He paused and then went on in a sing-song, and he repeated the old words. "If they was a circus or a baseball game, we would 'a' went to her. Just said to hell with work and went to her. Never asked nobody say so. And they'd 'a' been a pig and chickens, and in the winter the little fat stove and the rain comin', and a just settin' there." His eyes blinded with tears, and he turned and went weakly out of the barn, and he rubbed his bristly whiskers with his wrist stump. Outside, the noise of the game stopped. There was a rise of voices in question, a drum of running feet, and the men burst into the barn. Slim and Carlson and young Wit and Curly and Crooks keeping back out of attention range. Candy came after him, and last of all came George. George had put on his blue denim coat and buttoned it, and his black hat was pulled down low over his eyes. The men raced around the last stall. Their eyes found Curly's wife in the gloom. They stopped and stood still and looked. Then Slim went quietly over to her, and he felt her wrist. One lean finger touched her cheek, and then his hand went under her slightly twisted neck, and his fingers explored her neck. When he stood up, the men crowded near, and the spell was broken. Curly came suddenly to life. "I know who done it," he said. "That big son of a bitch done it. I know he done it. While everybody else was out there playing horseshoes." He worked himself into a fury. "I'm going to get him. I'm going for my shotgun. I'll kill the big son of a bitch myself. I'll shoot him in the guts. Come on, you guys." He ran he ran furiously out of the barn. Carlson said, "I'll get my Luger," and he ran out too. Slim turned quietly to George. "I guess Lenny done it all right," he said. "Her neck's bust. Lenny could have did that." George didn't answer, but he nodded slowly. His hat was so far down on his forehead that his eyes were covered. Slim went on. "Maybe like that time and weed you was telling us about." Goodness. Again, George nodded. Slim sighed. "Well, I guess we got to go get him. Where you think he might have went?" It seemed to take George some time to free his words. "He would have went south," he said. "We come from north, so he would have went south." "I guess we got to get him," Slim repeated. George stepped close. "Couldn't we maybe bring him in and they lock him up? He's nuts, Slim. He never done this to be mean." Slim nodded. "We might," he said. "If we could keep Curly in, we might, but Curly's going to want to shoot him. Curly's still mad about his hand, and suppose they lock him up and strap him down and put him in a cage. That ain't no good, George." "I know," said George. "I know." Carlson came running in. "The bastard stole my Luger," he shouted. "It ain't in my bag." Curly followed him, and Curly carried a shotgun in his good hand. Curly was cold now. "All right, you guys," he said. "The nigger's got a shotgun. You take it, Carlson. When you see him, don't give him no chance. Shoot for his guts. That'll double him over." Wit said excitedly, "I ain't got a gun." Curly said, "You go in Soledad and get a cop. Get Al Wilts. He's deputy sheriff. Let's go now." He turned suspiciously on George. "You're coming with us, fella." "Yeah," said George. I'll come. But listen, Curly. The poor bastard's nuts. Don't shoot him. He didn't know what he was doing." "Don't shoot him!" Curly cried. "He got Carlson's Luger. Course we'll shoot him." George said weakly, "Maybe Carlson lost his gun." "I seen it this morning," said Carlson. "No, it's been took." Slim stood looking down at Curly's wife. He said, "Curly, maybe you better stay here with your wife." Curly's face reddened. "I'm going," he said. "I'm going to shoot the guts out of that big bastard myself. Even if I only got one hand, I'm going to get him." Slim turned to Candy. You stay here with her then, Candy. The rest of us better get going. They moved away. George stopped a moment beside Candy, and they both looked down at the dead girl until Curly called, You, George, you stick with us so we don't think you had nothing to do with this. George moved slowly after them, and his feet dragged heavily. And when they were gone, Candy squatted down in the hay and watched the face of Curly's wife. Poor bastard, he said softly. The sound of the men grew fainter. The barn was darkening gradually, and in their stalls the horses shifted their feet and rattled the halter chains. Old Candy lay down in the hay and covered his eyes with his arm. Chapter 6. The deep green pool of the Salinas River was still in the late afternoon. Already the sun had left the valley to go climbing up the slopes of the Gabilan Mountains, and the hilltops were rosy in the sun. But by the pool, among the mottled sycamores, a pleasant shade had fallen. A water snake glided smoothly up the pool, twisting its periscope head from side to side, and it swam the length of the pool and came to the legs of a motionless heron that stood in the shallows. A silent head and beak lanced down and plucked it out by the head, and the beak swallowed the little snake while its tail waved frantically. A far rush of wind sounded, and a gust drove through the tops of the trees like a wave. The sycamore leaves turned up their silver sides. The brown, dry leaves on the ground scudded a few feet, and row on row of tiny wind waves flowed up the pool's green surface. As quickly as it had done, the wind died, and the clearing was quiet again. The heron stood in the shallows, motionless and waiting. Another little water snake swam up the pool, turning its periscope head from side to side. Suddenly, Lenny appeared out of the brush, and he came as silently as a creeping bear moves. The heron pounded the air with its wings, jacked itself clear of the water, and flew off down the river. The little snake slid in among the reeds at the pool's side. Lenny came quietly to the pool's edge. He knelt down and drank, barely touching his lips to the water. When a little bird skittered over the dry leaves behind him, his head jerked up and he strained toward the sound with eyes and ears until he saw the bird, and then he dropped his head and drank again. When he was finished, he sat down on the bank with his side to the pool so that he could watch the trail's entrance. He embraced his knees and laid his chin down on his knees. The light climbed on out of the valley, and as it went, the tops of the mountains seemed to blaze with increasing brightness. Lenny said softly, I didn't forget, you bet, damn. Hide in a brush and wait for George. He pulled his hat down low over his eyes. George gonna give me hell, he said. George gonna wish he's alone and not have bothering me bothering him. He turned his head and looked at the bright mountain top. I can go right out there and find a cave, he said. And he continued sadly, and never have no ketchup. But I won't care. If George don't want me, I'll go away. I'll go away. And then, from out of Lenny's head, there came a little fat old woman. She wore thick bullseye glasses, and she wore a huge gingham apron with pockets, and she was starched and clean. She stood in front of Lenny and put her hands on her hips, and she frowned disapprovingly at him. And when she spoke, it was in Lenny's voice. I told you, she said. I told you, mind George, because he's such a nice fella and good to you. But you don't ever take no care. You do bad things. And Lenny answered her. I tried, Aunt Clara, ma'am. I tried and tried. I couldn't help it. You never give a thought to George, she went on in Lenny's voice. He'd been doing nice things for you all the time. When he got a piece of pie, you always got half or more'n half. And if they was any ketchup, why, he'd give it all to you. I know, said Lenny miserably. I tried, Aunt Clara, ma'am. I tried and I tried. She interrupted him. All the time he could have had such a good time if it wasn't for you. He would have took his pay and raised hell in a whorehouse, and he could have sat in a pool room and played snooker. But he got to take care of you. Lenny moaned with grief. I know, Aunt Clara, ma'am. I go right off in them hills and I'll find a cave and I'll live there so I won't be no more trouble to George. You just say that, she said sharply. You're always saying that, and you know, son of a bitch, and well, you ain't never going to do it. You'll just stick around and stew the bejesus out of George all the time. Lenny said, I might just as well go away. George ain't going to let me tend no rabbits now. Aunt Clara was gone, and from out of Lenny's head there came a gigantic rabbit. It sat on its haunches in front of him, and it waggled its ears and crinkled its nose at him, and it spoke in Lenny's voice, too. 10 rabbits, it said scornfully. You crazy bastard. You ain't fit to lick a boots of no rabbit. You forget 'em and let 'em go hungry. That's what you do. And then what would George think? I would not forget, Lenny said loudly. The hell you wouldn't, said the rabbit. You ain't worth a greased jack pin to ram you into hell. Christ knows George done everything he could to jack you out of the sewer, but but it don't do no good. If you think George gonna let you tend rabbits, you're even crazier 'n usual. He ain't. He's gonna beat the hell out of you with a stick. That's what he's gonna do. Now Lenny retorted belligerently. He ain't neither. George won't do nothing like that. I knew George since I forget when. He never raised his hand to me with a stick. He's nice to me. He ain't gonna be mean. Well, he's sick of you, said the rabbit. He's gonna beat the hell out of you and then go away and leave you. He won't, Lenny cried frantically. He won't do nothing like that. I know George. Me and him travels together. But the rabbit repeated softly over and over, He gonna leave you, you crazy bastard. He gonna leave you all alone. He gonna leave you, crazy bastard. Lenny put his hands over his ears. He ain't. I tell you he ain't. And he said, Oh, George, George, George. George came quietly out of the brush, and the rabbit scuttled back into Lenny's brain. George said quietly, What the hell you yelling about? Lenny got up on his knees. You ain't gonna leave me, are you, George? I know you ain't. George came stiffly near and sat down beside him. No. I knowed it, Lenny cried. You ain't that kind. George was silent. Lenny said, George? Yeah. I done another bad thing. Well, ain't you gonna say it? George shook himself. He said woodenly, If I was alone, I could live so easy. His voice was monotonous, had no emphasis. I'd get a job and not have no mess. He stopped. Go on, said Lenny. And when the end of the month come, and when the end of the month come, I could take my $50 and go to a cat house. He stopped again. Lenny looked eagerly at him. Go on, George. Ain't you going to give me no more hell? No, said George. Well, I can go away, said Lenny. I'll go right off in the hills and find a cave if you don't want me. George shook himself again. No, he said. I want you to stay here with me. Lenny said craftily, Tell me like you done before. Tell you what? About the other guys and about us. George said, Guys like us got no family. They make a little stake and then they blow it. They ain't got nobody in the world that gives a hoot in the hell about 'em. But not us, Lenny cried happily. Tell about us now. George was quiet for a moment. But not us, he said. Because I got you, And I got you. We got each other. That's what. That gives a hoot in the hell about us," Lenny cried in triumph. The little evening breeze blew over the clearing, and the leaves rustled, and the wind waves flowed up the green pool, and the shouts of men sounded again, this time much closer than before. George took off his hat. He said shakily, "Take off your hat, Lenny. The air feels fine." Lenny removed his hat dutifully and laid it on the ground in front of him. The shadow in the valley was bluer, and the evening came fast. On the wind, the sound of crashing in the brush came to them. Lenny said, "Tell how it's gonna be." George had been listening to the distant sounds. For a moment he was businesslike. "Look across the river, Lenny, and I'll tell you so you can almost see it." Lenny turned his head and looked off across the pool and up the darkening slopes of the Gabalins. "We gonna get a little place," George began. He reached in his side pocket and brought out Carlson's Luger. He snapped off the safety, and the hand and gun lay on the ground behind Lenny's back. He looked at the back of Lenny's head, at the place where the spine and skull were joined. A man's voice called from up the river, and another man answered. "Go on," said Lenny. George raised the gun, and his hand shook, and he dropped his hand to the ground again. "Go on," said Lenny. "How's it gonna be? We gonna get a little place." "We'll have a cow," said George, "and we'll have maybe a pig and chickens, and down the flat we'll have a little piece alfalfa." "For the rabbits," Lenny shouted. "For the rabbits," George repeated. "And I get to tend the rabbits." "And you get to tend the rabbits." Lenny giggled with happiness. "And live on the fallow land." "Yes." Lenny turned his head. "No, Lenny. Look down there across the river, like you can almost see the place." Lenny obeyed him. George looked down at the gun. There were crashing footsteps in the brush now. George turned and looked toward them. "Go on, George. When we gonna do it?" "Gonna do it soon, me and you. You and me. Everybody gonna be nice to you. Ain't gonna be no more trouble. Nobody gonna hurt nobody nor steal from 'em." Lenny said, "I thought you was mad at me, George." "No," said George. "No, Lenny, I ain't mad. I never been mad. And I ain't now. That's a thing I want you to know." The voices came close now. George raised the gun and listened to the voices. Lenny begged, "Let's do it now. Let's get that place now." "Sure. Right now. We gotta." And George raised the gun and steadied it, and he brought the muzzle of it close to the back of Lenny's head. The hand shook violently, but his face set, and his hand steadied. He pulled the trigger. The crash of the shot rolled up the hills and rolled down again. Lenny jarred and then settled slowly forward to the sand, and he lay without quivering. George shivered and looked at the gun, and then he threw it from him, back up on the bank near the pile of old ashes. The brush seemed filled with cries and with the sound of running feet. Slim's voice shouted, "George! Where you at, George?" But George sat stiffly on the bank and looked at his right hand that had thrown the gun away. The group burst into the clearing, and Curly was ahead. He saw Lenny lying on the sand. "Got him, by God!" He went over and looked down at Lenny, and then he looked back at George. "Right in the back of the head," he said softly. Slim came directly to George and sat down beside him, sat very close to him. "Never you mind," said Slim. "A guy got to sometimes." But Carlson was standing over George. "How'd you do it?" he asked. "I just done it," George said tiredly. "Did he have any gun?" "Yeah, he had your gun." "And you got it away from him and you took it and you killed him?" "Yeah, that's how." George's voice was almost a whisper. He looked steadily at his right hand that had held the gun. Slim twitched George's elbow. Come on, George. Me and you'll go in and get a drink. George let himself be helped to his feet. Yeah, a drink. Slim said, You hadda, George. I swear you hadda. Come on with me. He led George into the entrance of the trail and up toward the highway. Curly and Carlson looked after them, and Carlson said, Now what the hell you supposin' is eating them two guys? The end. What a book. That's a tough one. I don't know if you guys remember reading that. Did you guys read that in high school? I remember reading it in high school. And I remember it being tough then too. Got all choked up at the end. It's such a good story though. I mean, it's like I said, it hits home, for I think anybody who's had a family member with a disability or even anyone who's been bullied, you just really feel for Lenny in his plight, and he's not trying to cause trouble. He has a good heart. He just doesn't know his own strength, and he gets himself into trouble, and eventually the trouble finds him back, and that's it for Lenny. Um, I always wondered what happened to George after that. I have to think George would never be the same, and I doubt he ever got that piece of land either, because I don't think he could have loved it without Lenny. There's that part of my brain that hopes that he and Candy and Curly all end up getting that piece of land anyway. But that's the part of me that likes happy endings and um, prefers them to reality. So I think it that's probably how it ended. Um, but that's all we've got. It only took 2 episodes to read that book, so I'm going to have to get busy on another one. We'll do something a little bit more with a happier ending. But if you've never read of Mice and Men, it was time well spent. I think just such a good book, and the imagery is so clear in my mind. Them in the barn and Lenny petting the puppy too hard, and um, but also the joyful things about Lenny, his love of ketchup and the rabbits and living off the fat in the land, and um, just very sweet. But anyway, that's all we've got. We ended up early today. We'll be back tomorrow at 4:30 for the Nurse Penny show, and I hope to see you guys there 4:30 Eastern. Um, and make sure you jump into the chat. If you like the show, please give it a like. It helps us in the algorithm. I think we get a penny a like or something like that, which doesn't sound like a lot of money. The bigger part is that it helps us in the algorithm. If you'd like to support the show, you can go to the description section and you'll see there are options for PayPal, Cash App, and Venmo. And we really appreciate that so that we're not carrying the full cost of the everything that's required to do the show. Um, thank you to everybody who does financially support the show. It means a lot to me. And you guys don't feel like you can't support the show because you can only give $5. I have a lot of people who give $5 a month and it adds up. Well, not a lot, but I have several people who give $5 a month and it helps a lot. Um, if you need me, I have my website, which is, I never can remember what it's called. Isn't that funny that I can't remember that? Hold on. I'll look. It's in my phone. Uh, it's Wit Health Coaching. No, yes, witthealthcoaching.com. And it's in the description, or I don't know if the website's in the description, but that's my website. You can go there and register for my Substack. I am working on getting some stuff out in my Substack. I hate that I'm not sending out messages. Life's just been kind of crazy, but you can sign up for my Substack there. My email is also there. You can also donate through the website. Um, and my email address is in the description section. If you need something, email me. I remind people, give me 2 weeks to answer and then get worried. I don't generally take that long. But, I've got a lot of things going on right now. So I get through, and I get a lot of email, a lot. So it takes me a little bit to wade through those. But let me pray us out. That's all I have for us today. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this time together and for just the rich stories, the narratives um, of life. and how they, even though many of us might not know a Lenny or a George or a Curly or a Candy, we know people like them, and when we know those sorts of stories. And Father, I would ask that you help us become a positive part of someone else's story. Help us behave selflessly. Um, Help us love without expecting anything in return. And Father, help us love with the love that you gave us, because that's something that doesn't get depleted in us. The Holy Spirit refills that over and over again. And we just pray that the light of our Savior would be just pouring out of us, getting all over everybody around us until people look at us and say, wow, there's something different about her, and give us the opportunity to tell them that it's Jesus and invite them to that relationship as well. Father, for anybody here who doesn't know Jesus, um, they can pray this short prayer. Father, we thank you for sending your son Jesus as our Savior to die for our sins. We thank you that he is our friend and that he is our brother and that our Father, just every relationship that we could have is wrapped up in Jesus. And we thank you that we have that kind of God, and we accept that gift that God gave us through his son, Jesus. We ask that you'd forgive us for all of the ways we go wrong, and we do every day. We just love that you're such a compassionate and forgiving God, and that you still draw us into your arms to love us. We thank you so much for that gift of Jesus, and it's in his name we pray. Amen. All right, guys. I love you whole big bunches. I will see you Friday tomorrow at 4:30 Eastern for the Nurse Penny podcast. Lots of interesting things to talk about this week with the Fannie Willis trial, and they brought in Terrence Wade again, and we'll talk about that tomorrow. And they released the text messages. It's just blockbuster stuff. Some of, like I said, the most interesting television I've watched in a while as far as news. But we'll hit on all of that tomorrow night. I will see you guys then. I love you whole big bunches. Nurse Penny out.